1952, Sing Correctional Facility. The racial powder keg had exploded. White supremacists on one side, black inmates on the other, guards caught between with no way to stop what was coming. In 2 hours, 800 men would try to kill each other in the bloodiest prison uprising America had ever seen. But in solitary confinement, isolated from chaos, sat the one man who might prevent it, the same man the warden had locked away to protect himself from. Now he needed Bumpy Johnson to save them all. Sing in 1952 was a powder keg waiting to explode, built in 1826 for 600 inmates. By 1952 it housed nearly 900. Men were packed into cells built for one person. The dining hall could barely feed half the population at once. And worst of all, racial tensions boiling over across America had found their most dangerous expression within those concrete walls. The trouble started with a simple work assignment. The prison laundry was the most coveted job in Sing because it was indoors, relatively clean, and offered opportunities to trade information and contraband. For 20 years, those jobs had gone to white inmates, not because of official policy, but because of unofficial power structures that guards either couldn't or wouldn't challenge. But in March 1952, Warden James Morrison made a decision that would nearly cost him his life. He ordered that laundry assignments be distributed based on behavior and work records, not race. Suddenly, 12 of the 16 laundry positions went to black inmates. The white supremacist gang controlling much of Sing's underground economy didn't take this quietly. Led by convicted murderer Carl Ice Henderson, they demanded Morrison reverse his decision. When Morrison refused, Henderson declared war on every black inmate in Sing. The violence began slowly. A black prisoner would be found beaten in his cell. A white inmate would discover his food had been poisoned. Guards would find homemade weapons hidden in work areas. Each incident escalated the tension, pushed both sides closer to open conflict. By June 1952, Sing was divided into armed camps. White supremacists controlled the east cell block. Black inmates fortified the west wing. The dining hall became a battlefield where men sat with backs to walls and weapons hidden under shirts. Guards conducted daily searches and found enough makeshift weapons to arm a small army. Warden Morrison knew he was losing control, but he had limited options. Calling in state police would mean admitting failure and probably losing his job. Imposing martial law would turn his prison into a military camp. And separating inmates by race would be acknowledging that segregation was the only way to keep the peace. There was one other option, but Morrison had sworn he'd never use it. In solitary confinement, isolated from the general population for 6 months, was Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, the most respected and most feared black inmate in Sing's history. Bumpy had arrived at Sing in January 1952, sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy and tax evasion. The charges were federal, but his reputation was international. Even in Sing surrounded by killers and bank robbers, Bumpy commanded a level of respect that made hardened criminals step aside when he walked down a corridor. That respect had made Warden Morrison nervous. Morrison had seen what happened in other prisons when powerful crime figures were allowed to operate freely. They created shadow governments more powerful than official authority. They turned correctional facilities into criminal headquarters. They corrupted guards, intimidated officials, and made rehabilitation impossible. So Morrison made a preemptive decision. 3 weeks after Bumpy's arrival, Morrison had him transferred to solitary confinement following a minor altercation with a guard. The real reason wasn't the fight. It was fear that Bumpy's presence would upset the delicate balance Morrison had spent 5 years building. For 6 months, Bumpy Johnson had been locked in a 6-by-8-foot cell with no human contact except meal deliveries and medical checks. No books, no radio, no newspapers, no conversation. It was psychological torture designed to break even the strongest minds. But Bumpy Johnson's mind wasn't breaking. It was planning. June 15th, 1952. 2:30 p.m. The incident that triggered everything happened in the machine shop. A black inmate named Robert Washington was operating a metal press when Carl Henderson walked up behind him with a homemade knife. Henderson intended to send a message by crippling or killing Washington in front of 40 witnesses. Washington saw the attack coming. He grabbed a heavy wrench and swung at Henderson's head. Henderson ducked and lunged forward with the knife. The blade caught Washington in the shoulder, spinning him into the metal press. The machine crushed Washington's arm before anyone could hit the emergency stop. Blood sprayed across the shop floor. Washington screamed. Henderson stood over him, knife raised for a killing blow. That's when every black inmate in the shop rushed Henderson. They didn't care about consequences. They didn't care about additional sentences. They only cared about protecting one of their own from a racist killer. The fight lasted 3 minutes. When guards arrived with clubs and tear gas, they found Henderson unconscious, 4 black inmates beaten bloody, and 40 men standing in 2 distinct groups, glaring at each other with pure hatred. Washington was rushed to the prison hospital, where doctors managed to save his life but not his arm. Henderson was taken to the infirmary with a severe concussion and 3 broken ribs. And Warden Morrison realized he had maybe 2 hours before racial war erupted throughout Sing Sing. 4:15 p.m. Morrison called an emergency meeting with his senior guards. The report was grim. Intelligence from prison informants indicated that both sides were preparing for massive retaliation. White supremacists were planning to storm the West Cell Block at dinner time. Black inmates were sharpening weapons and preparing to defend themselves. "How many men do we have available?" Morrison asked. 36 guards on duty, Captain Rodriguez replied. "Maybe 12 more if we call in off-duty staff." 48 men to control 800 inmates who want to kill each other? "That's the situation, sir." Morrison looked at the prison layout spread across his desk. Sing Sing's design made crowd control nearly impossible. Long corridors with multiple choke points, cell blocks that could be barricaded and defended, a dining hall that could become a massacre site. What about state police? 2 hours minimum response time, maybe 3 if they need to mobilize tactical units. Morrison checked his watch. 4:20 p.m. Dinner was at 5 p.m. That's when 800 men would gather in one room, divided by race, armed with improvised weapons ready for war. "Sir," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, "there is one other option." Morrison knew what Rodriguez was suggesting. For 6 months, guards had told him racial tensions would disappear if Bumpy Johnson returned to general population, not because Bumpy would stop violence, but because he commanded enough respect from black inmates to negotiate peace. Morrison had always refused. Releasing Bumpy felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that criminal authority was stronger than legal authority. But watching 800 men prepare to slaughter each other, Morrison realized that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. 4:25 p.m. Morrison walked through Sing Sing's corridors toward solitary confinement for the first time in 6 months. He passed groups of inmates who stopped talking when they saw him, their faces tense with anticipation. He passed guards checking their equipment, knowing they were outnumbered 20-1. The solitary wing was underground, cut off from natural light and normal sound. Cell number 7 was at the end of a narrow corridor lined with steel doors. Morrison had walked this corridor hundreds of times as a young guard, but never with this kind of desperation. He stopped at Bumpy's door and looked through the small observation window. Inside, Bumpy Johnson sat on a narrow cot, reading a Bible by the light of a single bulb. He was thin from the poor food and lack of exercise, but his eyes were still sharp, still calculating. Morrison unlocked the door and stepped inside. "Warden," Bumpy said without looking up from his reading, "this is unexpected. We need to talk." Bumpy closed the Bible and looked at Morrison directly. "We've been needing to talk for 6 months. You just weren't ready to listen." Morrison sat down on the single chair, a plastic seat bolted to the wall. "The prison is about to explode. Racial violence. Maybe 50 dead before we can stop it. And you want my help. I want you to prevent a massacre." Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm, thoughtful. "Warden, you put me in this hole because you were afraid I'd have too much influence over the inmates. Now you want to use that influence to save your prison. I want to save lives." "Whose lives? Because if you'd cared about black lives 6 months ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Morrison felt the truth of that statement like a physical blow. He'd isolated Bumpy not because of any crime or violation, but because of racial fear. Fear that a powerful black man would upset the white power structure Morrison had inherited and maintained. "You're right," Morrison said quietly. "I made a mistake. But right now, 800 men are about to kill each other, and you're the only person who can stop it." Bumpy stood up slowly, stretching muscles that had been cramped in the small cell for months. "What exactly are you asking me to do? Walk into that dining hall and convince both sides to stand down. Just like that? Just like that." Bumpy smiled. Not a happy smile, but not a cruel one either. "Warden, do you know what happens to a man's mind after 6 months in solitary confinement?" Morrison didn't answer. "It breaks, or it gets stronger. Mine got stronger because I spent 6 months thinking about respect, authority, and what it means to be a leader. And I learned something you never understood." "What's that?" "You can't lead through fear. You can only lead through respect, and respect has to be earned, not imposed." Morrison checked his watch. 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes until dinner, 15 minutes until potential catastrophe. "Will you help?" Bumpy walked to the cell door and looked down the corridor toward the general population. "I'll help, but not for you. For the men who've been living in hell while you pretended everything was fine." They walked through Sing Sing's corridors side by side. Guards stared in shock. Inmates whispered to each other. Word spread faster than Morrison could walk. Bumpy Johnson was out of solitary. The dining hall was a cavernous room with long metal tables bolted to the floor. By 4:55 p.m., it was packed with 800 inmates sitting in strictly racial groups. White supremacists on one side, black inmates on the other, with a narrow DMZ down the middle patrolled by nervous guards. The tension was so thick it felt like breathing smoke. Men sat with their backs straight, hands ready to grab hidden weapons. Conversations were whispered. Eyes constantly scanned for threats. When Bumpy Johnson walked into the dining hall, the entire room went silent. He didn't head to the black section. He didn't acknowledge the white supremacists. Instead, he walked to the center of the room, to the exact middle of the DMZ, and stood there. For 30 seconds, nobody moved. 800 men stared at a figure they'd heard about for months but hadn't seen. The legend who'd been buried in solitary now returned like a ghost. Then Bumpy spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silence, every word carried to the back of the room. "Some of you think this is about race," he said. "It's not. It's about respect." He turned toward Carl Henderson, who sat with his white supremacist crew, bandaged head visible from the fight. "Carl, you think beating down black men makes you strong. It doesn't. It makes you weak, because strong men don't need to prove their power by hurting people who can't fight back." Henderson started to stand, but Bumpy's stare made him sit back down. Then Bumpy turned toward the black inmates. "And some of you think violence will earn you respect. It won't. Respect comes from how you carry yourself, how you treat others, how you handle yourself when things get hard." He paused, looking around the room. "In 2 minutes, you were all planning to kill each other. For what? Because some jobs got reassigned, because someone's pride got hurt, because you'd rather die fighting than live thinking?" The room remained dead silent. "I've been in that hole for 6 months, Bumpy continued. 6 months of darkness, silence, and nothing but time to think. And you know what I thought about? This place, these men, this war that's been building." He walked closer to the black inmates. "We're not here to prove we're tough. We're here to prove we're men, and men don't solve their problems with blood unless there's no other choice." Then he walked toward the white supremacists. "And you think being white makes you better. You're in the same prison, wearing the same clothes, eating the same food as every other man here. Color doesn't make you special. Character does." Bumpy returned to the center of the room. "So here's what's going to happen. You're all going to eat your dinner. You're going to go back to your cells, and tomorrow you're going to remember that respect isn't something you take. It's something you earn." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, men began picking up their forks. Conversations resumed in whispers. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted from explosive to manageable. Carl Henderson looked around his table, then stood up. For a moment, Morrison thought the violence was starting anyway, but Henderson just picked up his tray and walked out of the dining hall. One by one, his followers did the same. The dinner that was supposed to become a bloodbath became just another meal. Later that evening, Warden Morrison found Bumpy in the prison library, reading quietly at a corner table. "Thank you," Morrison said. Bumpy looked up from his book. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't over." "What do you mean?" "I stopped a riot. I didn't solve the problem. The problem is that you've got 800 men locked in cages with no hope, no respect, and no reason to believe tomorrow will be better than today." Morrison sat down across from him. "What would you suggest?" "Treat them like men instead of animals. Give them work that means something. Education that prepares them for life outside. And stop running this place like a plantation where some people matter more than others." Over the following months, Morrison implemented many of Bumpy's suggestions. Work programs were integrated, educational opportunities expanded, and racial tensions, while never eliminated, never again reached the breaking point. Bumpy Johnson served his remaining sentence without incident. When released in 1956, even guards shook his hand. The riot that was supposed to kill dozens never happened. Not because of force, not because of fear, but because one man understood that leadership means more than giving orders. Sometimes the most dangerous prisoner in America is also the most valuable.